It is 1718, somewhere in the windward passage between Cuba and Hispaniola. You are below decks on a sloop flying no nation's colours. The hold is dark, the air is hot, and the smell is something you will never, in the rest of your life, forget. There is a barrel in front of you. It was sealed in Port Royal 4 months ago with 200 pounds of salt beef packed in brine. You pry the lid. The brine has gone the colour of old rust. A film of grey-green mould rides the surface. Underneath, the meat has turned to something between leather and putty, shrunken, slick, the colour of a bruise, and moving. Tiny white maggots, hundreds of them, threading through the fibres like living stitches. Your shipmate beside you does not flinch. He reaches in, pulls out a chunk, scrapes the worst of the larvae off with a rigger's knife, and drops it into the communal pot. Tonight, you will eat this. You will eat it because there is nothing else. You will eat it because the nearest friendly port is 6 weeks of contrary wind away, and no merchant will sell provisions to a pirate. This is not a horror story. This is Tuesday. Today, we are going below decks, past the cannons and the cutlasses, past the treasure chests that never really existed, past every romantic myth Hollywood ever sold you about life under the black flag. And we are going to the galley, to the barrels, to the water casks, to the place where piracy was not adventure, but animal survival. Because the real enemy of every pirate who ever sailed was not the Royal Navy. It was not the hangman's rope. It was hunger, thirst, and the slow biological horror of food rotting in a wooden ship in the tropics. This is the ugly truth about pirate food. To understand what pirates ate, you first need to understand what every sailor ate, because pirate cuisine, if we can call it that, was not some exotic underworld diet. It was standard naval provisioning pushed past its breaking point by one brutal reality. Pirates could not resupply. In the early 18th century, feeding a ship's crew was an industrial problem. The Royal Navy's Victualling Board, established formally under Samuel Pepys in the 1680s, was one of the largest food procurement operations in the world. By the 1700s, it was purchasing and packing thousands of tons of salt beef, salt pork, dried peas, oatmeal, cheese, butter, and beer every year, enough to feed tens of thousands of men at sea for months at a time. The standard Royal Navy weekly ration, codified by regulation, allocated each man roughly 4 pounds of salt beef, 2 pounds of salt pork, 2 pints of dried peas, 3 pints of oatmeal, 6 ounces of butter, 12 ounces of cheese, a daily pound of hardtack biscuit, and, crucially, a gallon of beer per day, later substituted with half a pint of rum in tropical stations. These were not generous portions. They were survival rations, calculated to keep a man functional at hard labour. But even the Navy, with its dockyards, its supply chain, and its network of allied ports from Portsmouth to Kingston to Bombay, struggled to keep food from spoiling at sea. Salt meat packed in brine could last months, but in tropical heat, the brine went foul, the salt leached, and putrefaction set in. Hardtack biscuit was baked to the density of ceramic specifically to resist moisture, but weevils bored into it within weeks. Cheese sweated and grew mould. Butter turned rancid in its cask. Beer, brewed weak to fill volume, soured and became vinegar. And water, stored in wooden casks, turned green with algae, then black with decay, acquiring a stench that sailors described as worse than bilge. Now remove the supply chain, remove the dockyards, remove the allied ports, remove the victualling board and every network of legitimate commerce. That is a pirate ship. A pirate vessel was, at its core, a floating community that had declared war on the entire commercial world, and then had to eat. This was the fundamental paradox. Every merchant you robbed was also, potentially, a source of food. Every port you terrorized was a port you could never safely enter again to buy bread. The logistical challenge was enormous. A typical pirate sloop of the early 1700s carried between 50 and 80 men, far more crew per ton than a merchant vessel of similar size. Merchant ships sailed lean, with perhaps 15 to 20 crew for a vessel of 100 tons. Pirates needed numbers for boarding actions, prize crews, and round-the-clock watches in hostile waters. More men meant more mouths. More mouths meant faster consumption. Faster consumption meant more frequent need to resupply from a world that wanted you dead. Bartholomew Roberts, operating off West Africa between 1719 and 1722, commanded at his peak over 500 men spread across multiple vessels, including the 40-gun Royal Fortune. Feeding that company required capturing provisions almost continuously. Edward Teach, Blackbeard, blockaded the port of Charleston of South Carolina in May 1718, not for gold, but partly for a chest of medicines. When pirates targeted merchant ships, they often prioritized the cargo hold over the captain's cabin. Flour, salt pork, rum, and medical supplies were worth more to survival than silver plate. The records of the Admiralty Court trials at Nassau, at Jamaica, and at Cape Coast Castle contain repeated inventories of goods seized by pirates, and the lists are revealing. Alongside the expected cargoes of sugar, tobacco, and textiles, captured manifests routinely list barrels of beef and pork, casks of flour, hogsheads of beer and wine, bushels of corn, bags of rice, and, especially in the Caribbean, live turtles. Green sea turtles were, for Caribbean pirates especially, a critical food source. Found in vast numbers around the Cayman Islands, along the Mosquito Coast of Central America, and throughout the Bahamas, green turtles could be captured alive, flipped onto their backs on deck, and kept alive for weeks without food or water. They were, in effect, living refrigerators, fresh meat that would not rot until you killed it. William Dampier, the Buccaneer naturalist who published A New Voyage Round the World in 1697, devoted extensive passages to the qualities of turtle flesh, praising it as sweet, wholesome, and sustaining. Turtle soup and roasted turtle became staple pirate fare in the Caribbean, and the practice was so widespread that turtle populations in the region were severely depleted by the mid-18th century. When pirates made landfall on uninhabited islands, river mouths, or secluded bays, foraging parties went ashore with the urgency of a military operation. They hunted feral pigs and goats on islands where Spanish and Portuguese settlers had introduced livestock generations earlier. They gathered coconuts, plantains, and wild citrus where it grew. They dug wells in beach sand, hoping the freshwater lens beneath the island had not gone brackish. On the Mosquito Coast, Mosquito Indian strikers, indigenous fishermen hired or allied with buccaneering crews, were prized above almost any other specialist aboard because they could harpoon manatees, turtles, and fish with a skill that European sailors could not match. Dampier's accounts make clear that a mosquito striker could mean the difference between a crew eating and a crew starving. But turtles were a Caribbean advantage. Pirates operating in the Atlantic, off the West African coast, or in the Indian Ocean had no such luxury. There, the provisions came from prizes, whatever the last captured ship happened to carry, and from the occasional clandestine deal with corrupt port officials or sympathetic traders. Madagascar, for a time, served as an informal pirate provisioning base in the Indian Ocean. Ports along the West African coast, including the Slave Coast near Whydah and the Gold Coast near Anamabu, offered intermittent opportunities to trade plundered goods for food and water. But these arrangements were precarious, dependent on local politics, and liable to collapse the moment a Royal Navy patrol appeared. So what, specifically, went into the belly of a working pirate in the year 1715 or 1720? Start with the staple, hardtack, called ship's biscuit, mould bread, or simply bread in contemporary sources. Hardtack was a flat, unleavened cracker baked from flour, water, and sometimes a pinch of salt, then kiln-dried until it was so hard it could chip a tooth. It was not food in any sense that you would recognize. It was a delivery system for calories, dense, compact, nearly indestructible. A barrel of hardtack, properly sealed, could last years. The problem was that barrels on a pirate ship were rarely properly sealed. And even when they were, weevils found their way in. The biscuit beetle, Stegobium paniceum, laid eggs in flour before the biscuit was even baked. The larvae survived the oven, hatched inside the bread, and bored through it from within. Experienced sailors learned to eat their hardtack in the dark, so they would not have to see what was crawling through it. Others tapped the biscuit sharply on the table before eating, to knock the weevils loose. The most pragmatic simply ate everything, weevil, larvae, and bread together. The protein, they reasoned, was a bonus. Salt meat was the other staple, and its degradation was far worse. Beef and pork were preserved by packing in coarse salt and sealing in barrels of brine, a technique that, under ideal conditions, could preserve meat for 6 months or more. But conditions at sea were never ideal. Tropical heat accelerated bacterial growth. Barrels leaked. Salt settled to the bottom, leaving the upper layers of meat exposed. The result was a product that period sources describe with a consistency like mahogany, a colour like old lead, and a smell that could make a man gag from 10 feet away. Ned Ward, the English satirist who published The Wooden World in 1707, an acidic portrait of life in the Royal Navy, described salt beef served to common sailors as so hard that it could be carved into buttons, and so foul that a dog would think twice. Edward Barlow, a seaman who kept a detailed journal between the 1660s and 1703, recorded that salt meat on long voyages acquired a loathsome smell and was riddled with white grubs. These were not literary exaggerations, they were occupational reports. On a pirate ship, where provisioning was irregular and storage conditions were worse than on a naval vessel, pirates rarely had the manpower or inclination for the constant maintenance of casks, bilge pumps, and ventilation that naval regulations required. The degradation was accelerated. Meat that was merely unpleasant on a king's ship became genuinely dangerous on a pirate sloop. And then there was the dish that has become synonymous with pirate cuisine, salmagundi. The word, borrowed from the French salmigondis, described not a specific recipe, but a method, a catch-all stew of whatever protein was available, chopped and mixed with whatever vegetables, pickles, oil, vinegar, and spices could be found. A salmagundi aboard a well-provisioned pirate vessel might include turtle meat, fish, chicken or pigeon taken from a prize, hard-boiled eggs, onions, cabbage, pickled mangoes, palm hearts, garlic, and pepper, all dressed with oil and vinegar and served cold or warm. Aboard a badly provisioned one, it was salt beef scraps, hardtack crumbs, a handful of dried peas, and whatever edible weeds could be gathered from a shoreline stop. Salmagundi was not a delicacy, it was a survival strategy. By combining every scrap of available nutrition into a single pot, a ship's cook, often a crippled or aged pirate no longer fit for boarding actions, assigned to the galley as a secondary role, could stretch dwindling provisions across more meals and more men. The communal nature of the dish also served a social function aboard pirate ships, where articles of agreement frequently stipulated equal shares of food for every crew member, captain included. Cooking itself was a constrained and dangerous art aboard a wooden ship. The galley fire, a small brick or stone firebox, sometimes lined with iron, set on the lowest deck or in a specially ventilated area amidships, could only be lit in calm weather. In heavy seas, the fire was extinguished to prevent the ship from burning, and the crew ate cold provisions, raw hardtack, uncooked salt meat gnawed from the chunk, and whatever cold leftovers remained in the pot from the last hot meal. Days of storm could mean days without a cooked meal. The firebox itself was small, the fuel, wood or charcoal, limited, and the single iron cauldron had to serve an entire crew. Meals were cooked in batches, each mess group of 6 to 8 men receiving their portion in rotation. Alcohol, meanwhile, was not a luxury aboard pirate vessels. It was a caloric necessity and a psychological anchor. Rum, brandy, wine and beer provided calories that food could not always deliver. and their preservation was far more reliable than that of solid provisions. A barrel of rum did not rot, did not breed weevils, and did not turn green. Pirates. Notorious reputation for drunkenness was not entirely a matter of character. It was partly a matter of logistics. When the food was gone or inedible, the spirits remained, and a man could survive on rum and hardtack for weeks if he had to. Bartholomew Roberts was the notable exception, a teetotaler who drank only tea. He was an anomaly in a profession where alcohol was both medicine and meal. But the darkest chapter of pirate provisioning was not the food, it was the water. Fresh water was the single most critical supply aboard any sailing vessel, and the hardest to maintain. Stored in wooden casks, typically oak, sometimes lined with pitch, water began to degrade within days of loading. Algae bloomed on the surface. Bacteria multiplied in the warm, dark interior of the cask. Within 2 to 3 weeks in tropical conditions, stored water turned green, then brown, then black, developing a thick, sulphurous stench that contemporary accounts compare to sewage. Mosquito larvae bred in it. A film of organic decay coated the interior of the cask. Sailors drank it anyway. There was no alternative. Techniques to make it more palatable included straining it through cloth, mixing it with vinegar, or, most commonly, mixing it with rum or brandy to mask the taste and, incidentally, to kill some of the surface bacteria through alcohol content. The practice of mixing rum with water was formalized in the Royal Navy by Vice Admiral Edward Vernon in 1740, who ordered the daily rum ration diluted with water, with sugar and lime juice suggested to improve the taste, the origin of grog. But pirates had been cutting foul water with spirits for decades before Vernon made it official. Dehydration killed more sailors, pirate and naval alike, than combat ever did. William Dampier recorded episodes during his circumnavigation in the 1680s and 1690s, where crews went days without fresh water, resorting to catching rainwater in spread sails, drinking the blood of slaughtered turtles, or, in desperation, drinking seawater, which only accelerated dehydration and, in extreme cases, caused hallucinations, seizures, and death. Now, about that rat stew, the image of a pirate gnawing on a roasted rat is one of the most persistent in popular culture, and, like many pirate myths, it is rooted in something real, but exaggerated beyond recognition. Rats were a fact of life on every wooden sailing ship. The brown rat and the black rat infested vessels from the moment they were launched, breeding in the hold, gnawing through rope and sailcloth, contaminating food stores, and spreading disease. A well-maintained Royal Navy ship of the line might carry hundreds of rats despite constant efforts at control. A pirate vessel, with less discipline and less maintenance, could carry thousands. Did sailors eat them? The historical evidence is thin, but suggestive. There are scattered references in period sources, primarily journals and memoirs of castaways and shipwreck survivors, rather than routine sailors, to eating rats during extreme privation. Alexandre Exquemelin, the French-Dutch surgeon who sailed with Henry Morgan in the 1660s and published The Buccaneers of America in 1678, described buccaneers on the verge of starvation eating leather, shoe soles, and, in one passage, rats and mice, which they hunted with great diligence. But Exquemelin is also our most vivid source, and his accounts sometimes blur into literary dramatic effect. Historians like David Cordingley and Marcus Rediker treat his specific claims with caution, noting that Exquemelin had commercial incentives to make pirate life sound as lurid as possible. The more accurate picture is this: rats were a last resort, not a menu item. In normal conditions, even the degraded normal of a poorly provisioned pirate ship, there was almost always something better to eat. Salt meat, however foul, was preferable. Hardtack, however wormy, was preferable. Fish could often be caught. Turtles could be hunted. Seabirds could be snared. Rats were what you ate when everything else was gone. And when everything else was gone, you were typically also days away from death. The myth persists because it is visceral. It captures something true, The desperation, the degradation, the gap between the pirate romance and the pirate reality. But it overstates the frequency. Most pirates, most of the time, ate badly. They did not eat rats. The distance between real pirate food and its portrayal in popular culture is measured in centuries of selective memory. When Robert Louis Stevenson wrote Treasure Island in 1883, he gave Long John Silver a parrot and a wooden leg, but almost no mention of what the crew ate. The omission was deliberate. Stevenson was writing adventure, not survival horror, and the realities of shipboard diet would have undermined the romance. The novel mentions apples in a barrel, the famous scene where Jim Hawkins overhears Silver's mutiny plot, but never hardtack, never salt horse, never the stench of rotting water. Disney's Pirates of the Caribbean franchise, beginning with The Curse of the Black Pearl in 2003, similarly sanitizes the galley. Captain Jack Sparrow is perpetually sun-kissed, lean but never starving. When food appears on screen, usually in the form of a green apple, an apparent nod to Stevenson, it is a prop for personality, not a marker of survival. The franchise's undead pirates are cursed to feel nothing, not even hunger. The irony is rich. In reality, hunger was the one thing every pirate felt, constantly. The most historically grounded portrayal of shipboard food in popular media remains Patrick O'Brian's Aubrey Maturin novels. Beginning with Master and Commander in 1969, O'Brian, drawing heavily on primary sources including naval logs, personal diaries, and Admiralty records, describes the daily meals of a Royal Navy crew with unflinching specificity: the Weevilly biscuit, the grey salt beef, the portable soup, made from dried bone and marrow extract, the slow misery of dwindling rations on a long passage. The 2003 film adaptation, Master and Commander, The Far Side of the World, briefly captured this in a dinner scene that showed officers eating food that, while better than the crew's, was still visibly austere. It is one of the few moments in mainstream cinema where the maritime diet is treated with something approaching accuracy. Here is what no one tells you about pirate freedom. The black flag meant you answered to no king, no admiral, no merchant company. You voted for your captain. You shared the spoils equally. You lived and fought and died on your own terms. These are the facts, and they are true, and they are extraordinary for the early 18th century. But freedom had a price, and that price was paid in the gut. Every pirate who signed the articles traded the regulated misery of naval or merchant service for an unregulated misery that could be far worse. A Royal Navy sailor ate badly, but he ate on schedule. His rations were measured, documented, and, in theory, inspected. His water, however foul, was replenished at regular intervals by a logistics network that spanned the globe. A pirate ate what he could take, when he could take it. Between prizes, there might be nothing. Between friendly ports, and there were very few, the barrels ran low. The water turned black, and the line between eating and starving was drawn by wind and luck. Scurvy, caused by vitamin C deficiency and producing bleeding gums, loosening teeth, reopening of old wounds, lethargy, and eventually death, was the single greatest killer of sailors in the Age of Sail. The Royal Navy did not formally adopt citrus juice as a preventive until the 1790s, following James Linn's clinical trial in 1747. Before that, scurvy killed more men than combat, shipwreck, and all other diseases combined. Pirates, with their irregular access to fresh fruit and vegetables, were even more vulnerable. Dysentery, bacterial infection of the intestines, spread by contaminated water and food, was a constant companion aboard pirate ships. Symptoms included bloody diarrhea, severe cramping, fever, and dehydration. On a vessel with no surgeon, no medicine, and no clean water, dysentery was often a death sentence. The mass mortality aboard HMS Weymouth during Captain Challoner Ogle's anti-piracy patrol off West Africa in 1721 to 1722, where disease killed more of Ogle's crew than Roberts' pirates ever did, illustrates the scale of the problem even for well-supplied naval vessels. For pirates, the toll was worse and went largely unrecorded. The toll is unrecorded and unrecordable. No one counted the pirates who died of dysentery in a hammock. No one documented the crews that simply vanished. Their sloop found drifting, empty, provisions exhausted, no bodies aboard. The Admiralty trial records at Cape Coast Castle in 1722, after the capture of Bartholomew Roberts' crew, noted that many of the surviving pirates were in advanced stages of malnutrition and tropical disease. These were men who had been eating, or trying to eat, for months on the West African coast. They had survived the Royal Navy only to be destroyed by their own provisions. This is the part of pirate history that resists romanticization. You cannot make maggots heroic. You cannot make rancid water cinematic. You cannot build a franchise around the slow, grinding, inglorious reality of a human body starving and rotting on a wooden ship in a tropical sea. But that reality was the foundation on which every pirate career was built. Before the boarding action, before the black flag, before the treasure, real or imagined, there was the question that every pirate answered every single day. What are we going to eat? And the answer, more often than they would have liked, was, whatever is left. Somewhere in the Caribbean, on a reef that has no name on any modern chart, there is a wreck. She was a sloop, maybe 60 feet, maybe 70. Her keel is buried in sand. Her ribs, what is left of them, are black with centuries of growth. Whatever flag she flew is long gone. Whatever name she carried is lost. But somewhere in her hold, beneath the coral, beneath the sediment, beneath 300 years of silence, there are barrels. Oak staves collapsed inward, iron hoops rusted to lace. They held salt beef once, or water, or flour. They held the thing that kept men alive long enough to die some other way. No treasure hunter will ever dive for those barrels. No museum will ever display them. They are not gold. They are not silver. They are not the stuff of legends. But they are the truth. They are the ugly, human, unglamorous truth of what it cost to live outside the law on a wooden ship, in an ocean that did not care whether you were free or not. The sea fed you when it chose. It starved you when it chose. And all the black flags in the world could not change the fact that a man needs water, and bread, and something in the pot. And that these ordinary things, when they ran out, were worth more than all the Spanish gold on the Main. The barrels are still down there. The sea keeps what it takes. And the men who ate from them, who choked down the maggots, who drank the black water, who carved the salt horse with a knife and called it supper, they are the real pirates. Not the ones in the movies, not the ones on the flags, the ones who were hungry, always hungry.